Whether online, in books, or at your local game store, there are a lot of places you can find advice on how to be a dungeon master. And there are tons of great resources out there that can help new and old DMs alike. But when there's so much floating around, it's inevitable that not all advice will work for every person. In this video, I want to bring up 5 pieces of advice that I see commonly given to DMs and talk about why I personally don't agree with them. I'll also offer some tips that I think get at the heart of what they're going for, if not a little different. To be clear, these are just my opinions, and if you feel differently, I'd love to hear why in the comments. Without further ado, let's get started. As a DM, giving your players the freedom to design characters that they're excited to play and fit into the world at large is essential to getting your party invested in the story. But over the decade that 5e has been around, and with brand new classes, items, and abilities having just been released, there are inevitably going to be things in your game you just don't like. Maybe you don't think it's fun to run for a certain species, or there's a particular spell you find really annoying. Should you be able to ban those at your table? Well, there are some out there who think absolutely not. If it's official content, it's fair game. And I've even seen people suggest that if you ban things at your table, you're being a bad DM. And it's true that there are plenty of examples where DMs will on the fly ban or nerf things that are balanced, but they weren't prepared for or don't fully understand. Sneak attack is a prime example of this, where a lot of new DMs see a rogue roll high on their one hit that turn and assume it needs fixing. It doesn't. Please stop doing that. But as the Dungeon Master, you're the one putting in most of the work to play the game. You have a right to run a campaign that you'll find just as fun as your players will. So banning things isn't something you should be afraid to do. My advice would be to communicate anything you want to ban clearly and before the game starts. If you know you don't want to deal with flying characters in this campaign, don't let your player make an Aarakocra and then put a ton of restrictions on it. At that point, are they even playing one? Or what if you don't like the spell Silvery Barbs? Tell your wizard instead of trying to play around it or nerfing it later. And if something does come up in play that you're not sure about, talk to your players about it. Don't just ban things and move on. Instead, have a chat and be open to the fact you might be missing how it relates to game balance or is important to the class. I think discussions around banning content are always fine to have, as long as you're listening to your party and being honest about what you don't want in your games. When people are first starting out, there's a sentiment online that you should always run pre-written content before you dive into homebrew. And it makes sense. There's less prep involved, you don't need to worry about encounter balance as much, and having a quest laid out for you can be a great way to learn how to structure an adventure or a campaign. If that works for you, I think that is awesome. But personally, when I first started DMing, I probably wouldn't have stuck with it if I was running a pre-written adventure. What really appealed to me about getting behind the screen were things like world building, quest design, and encounter creation. I wanted D&D to be a creative outlet, and while you can definitely change up and mess with modules, I wanted to be the one outlining the story. And I bet a lot of others out there feel that way too. Instead of insisting that newbies run pre-written content, I would advise starting simple. Whether you're running out of a book or making up your own adventure, it's probably best not to dive right into the most complex, layered story you can. Start with an easy, simple quest line, a starting city, a bit of exploration, and a fun dungeon. As you get comfortable, you can branch out from there and add on more paths and ideas. It's much easier to start small and make it bigger than to try something huge and have to scale it back later. If pre-written adventures work for you, that's great. I have a whole series of quests on this channel you can use in your games. But if you're new and want to run a homebrew campaign, you can have just as much success doing that too. In improv, there's a really important principle known as yes and. Basically, it's the idea that when performing, you should try to build off what others are doing rather than shut them down. If your scene partner says, "Look at my dog's new sweater," it'll kill all momentum if you respond, "That's actually a cat." In D&D, a lot of folks try to bring this same sentiment to DMing. It's a collaborative game, so you should always be trying to say yes to your players' ideas, right? But unlike a lot of improv, D&D is a game with rules and guidelines. If you always say yes to your players, why bother picking spells, abilities, and classes? Having a structure keeps the game from becoming whatever we all collectively make up, with no restrictions at all. And honestly, working within those rules can be just as fun as breaking them. I think a better piece of advice is, instead of just saying no, see if you can work with your players. No, the cleric can't jump off a cliff and fly, but the wizard can cast a spell on them that would allow it, or maybe they can just climb down instead using athletics. Do they have any equipment that can help? And in some cases, it might actually be better to bend the rules to let your players pull off some pretty cool stuff. The spell Vine Whip doesn't technically let you use it to swing through trees, but with a good athletics check, I'd let the druid try. It all depends on the situation. Working with them instead of against them will lead to better games. So yes, shutting down your players' ideas all the time isn't fun, but neither is letting them do whatever they want. Between the monster manual, splat books, and homebrew creations, there are tons of creatures out there that you can throw at your party. But encounter balance isn't an exact science, And it's true that sometimes a fight you think will be a challenge ends up getting steamrolled by your players, or one you figured would be easy can wipe the floor with them. To counter this, some DMs advocate for not tracking monster HP at all. Just wait until the fight has been exciting enough, and then decide when the monster dies. This can extend to dice rolls and stats as well. As long as your players don't know, then who cares? While this might work for some, I do have my own objections to it. First, using monsters with set stats and abilities gives your players a real sense of accomplishment. If the monster just dies when you decide, did they really defeat it? Second, the more you take matters into your own hands, the more you're directly responsible for your players' fun. If my dragon crits a player and knocks them out, the dice made that decision. But if I never rolled, why does the druid have to be unconscious while the wizard gets to keep playing? The dice help keep things fair. Last but not least, sometimes it's fun for a boss to get annihilated, or a low-stakes fight to go the distance. That random chance is part of what makes D&D fun. All that said, I would suggest to DMs that you should adjust as needed. There's nothing wrong with adding some HP to a monster because you underestimated the challenge it would pose, or throwing in an extra ability to spice up a battle that's dragging a bit. And yes, fudging a dice roll here and there isn't going to hurt anybody. Those sorts of changes can heighten tension and improve the game, without completely nullifying the monster's stats and your players' efforts. But when I say as needed, I mean it. Before you give the giant 100 more hit points or reveal that these goblins actually have breath weapons, look at everyone around the table. Are they having fun? Are they relishing in their victory? Sometimes letting them have a big win that they'll be talking about all week is better than a battle that came down to the last roll. Depending on who you ask, you might think prepping for your game is the worst thing imaginable. Many people insist that if you're preparing more than the bare minimum, you're doing it wrong. And honestly, it's easy to see why people feel that way. Prep isn't as fun as actually playing the game, and depending on what your players do, they might end up avoiding a lot of the notes that you took anyway. Or on the flip side, the DM might feel compelled to force their players down certain paths because they don't want their work to go to waste. But in my experience, trying to quantify how much prep you need to do per session, or saying that everyone should be writing as few notes as possible, just doesn't work for every DM. I write a bunch of notes when preparing for my games. By having a lot already written out, I feel more comfortable to pivot and improvise when my players do things that are unexpected. If you're a new DM and you've done the bare minimum of prep, you may struggle to fill in the gaps or come up with things on the fly without a base to work off of. My advice would be this: prep to your comfort level, but don't look too far ahead. Do whatever you need to do to feel comfortable when you sit down for your next session. For some, that might take 10 minutes. For others, a couple hours. As long as you're enjoying the process and not stressing yourself out, you're doing just fine. And if it is feeling like a slog, you might need to look into ways to scale back what you're doing. Figuring out what you actually need notes for and what you feel good coming up with in the moment can help with that process. The second part is that unless you're very confident and you know exactly what your players are going to do next, don't prep too far out. If the party is level 1 and you're already working on a boss for 10th level, you'll probably need to slow down and focus on the present. The further out you go, the more likely your players will veer off the path and force you to move things around and do a bunch of extra work anyway. There's no perfect way to prep, only whatever works best for you. Those are 5 pieces of DMing advice I don't really agree with, but I'm always open to other opinions. I'd love to hear why you agree, disagree, or fall somewhere in between in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, leaving a like is always appreciated. If you want to see more, you should subscribe to the Bard's College. I make videos all about D&D, DMing, and everything in between, so stick around. But for now, good luck, and remember, crit your players.